My name is Pat Bombard, and I serve as Director of Vincent on Leadership, the Hay Project at DePaul University. I am pleased to introduce DePaul student Adriana Stanovic, who is a graduate student in the School of Public Service at DePaul. She is getting her master's in public administration with a concentration on international issues. Adriana will moderate our evening plenary. So welcome, Adriana, and thank you for taking on this role. And I also want to welcome our three speakers for this evening. Adriana, if you want to unmute your mic, you can begin by introducing our presenters. We will have a Q&A after, a short Q&A after each presentation, and then we hope more time for all of us to dialogue afterwards. So welcome, Adriana, and welcome our presenters.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pat. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Our panel that we'll be listening to is focusing on sustainable values and values around sustainability. So we're excited to hear from three really wonderful speakers. I'll introduce the first. We'll hear his presentation, we'll do Q&A, and then I'll do the same for the remaining two. So our first speaker is Brother Kevin Cawley, a PhD, who is the Executive Director of the Thomas Berry Forum for Ecological Dialogue at Iona College. He has worked in educational ministry in a number of high schools as a teacher, coach, and administrator. He's also served on the faculty and in administration at Iona College and in leadership in his religious community. Kevin currently serves at United Nations headquarters in New York as the main representative of Edmund Rice International, and he produces a monthly newsletter for this organization on environmental concerns, Carbon Rangers, Ecozoic Times. Well, thank you so much, Brother Cawley. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm coming to you tonight from New Rochelle, New York, where Iona College is located. I want to thank everybody for this wonderful conference, particularly my friend Memo, who I'm sure has a lot to do with how this is working. And thank you, Sister Patricia, for organizing things. I have a few things to say in terms of the thank yous to the people who are working at the Thomas Berry Forum, who have been very helpful to me in putting these remarks together. I also have some slides and images that I want to use. I'm going to try to do a share screen. Can I do that now?
Yes, I believe you have that capability.
Okay. So that's up there now. Is it working?
Yes.
People can see those. Okay, well, I'm going to let this work my way forward. It's basically on its own. I'm going to say a few things there that will relate. The slides are not necessarily matched exactly to the text, but they'll give us some idea of what we're saying here. The term sustainability consciousness has a broad reach, certainly, and there are numerous paths forward in opening the idea for discussion. In this context, thank you for inviting me to present some remarks on the thinking of Thomas Berry, a Passionist priest and self-described geologian, who passed away in 2009. The images that we're looking at attempt to bring us closer to an appreciation, in particular, of the primordial expression of the universe, its overwhelming variety of manifestations in space and time and consciousness. Thomas Berry offered numerous insights on our world and how the universe unfolded. In these few moments, I will attend most directly to his thinking as to how the universe presents itself, using three basic principles: differentiation, subjectivity, and communion. These governing principles have controlled the evolutionary process of the entire universe from the moment of its explosive origin some 14 billion years ago to the shaping of the planet Earth, the emergence of life and consciousness, and so through the various ages of human history. Differentiation is the primordial expression of the universe. In the fiery violence of some billions of degrees of heat, the original energy dispersed as radiation and as differentiated particles that were further shaped into galactic systems, our own solar system, and the planets. Life on our home planet Earth finds expression in an overwhelming variety of manifestations, beginning with that fiery first instant. As the early universe rapidly stretched its scorching heat spread over an ever-widening expanse, diminishing in intensity and cooling steadily. Everything rose from that single point. The differentiation continues to move in myriad directions. In particular, our home planet, now teeming with uncountable species of living expressions of the expanding universe, and now, sadly, viruses, much in the news, an amount of biomass that is equivalent of about 25 billion human beings. Life is recognizable from the collective behavior, the large-scale organization, the overarching coordination of an enormous number of particulate constituents. Even a single cell contains more than 1 trillion atoms. Earth, as far as we know, is the most highly differentiated structure in the universe, beginning with the first hydrogen atom to the first bacteria, life in the ocean, to our early ancestors who stood up in the plains. Life has been expanding in ever greater complexity and mystery. When fully awake to these immensities, we stand mute in awe. How does an acorn know to become an oak tree? A secondary primary manifestation is that of increased subjectivity. We see that each individual is not only different from every other, but has its own inner articulation. The sacred depth of the individual entity is one's subjectivity. In the human, increasing self-expression or self-organizing led to increased complexity, out of which unfolds the development of the human brain and self-conscious awareness in the human. We experience the world as emergent diversification and differentiation. Each particle has its own interiority. Every particle has its own identifying inner structure, its inner being. In a sense, everything participates in person, as it were. Everything has its voice. From the shaping of the hydrogen atom to the formation of the human brain, interior psychic unity has consistently increased along with the greater complexification of being. The capacity for subjectivity involves increased unity of function through ever more complex organic structures. Increase in subjectivity is associated with increased complexity of the central nervous system. In this manner, planet Earth becomes ever more subject to the free interplay of self-determining forces. With subjectivity is manifest the numinous quality that has traditionally been associated with every differentiated reality of the universe. And yet nothing is completely itself without everything else. We need one another. We belong in communion. The third principle. The communion of every reality of the universe with each other. Here, our scientific evidence confirms with a magnificent overview the ancient awareness that we live in a universe, a single, if multiform, energy event. The unity of the entire complex of galactic systems is among the most basic experience of contemporary science. Although this comprehensive unity of the universe was perceived by indigenous peoples, nowhere was the full quantum entanglement and genetic relatedness of the universe presented with such clarity as by the scientists of the 20th century. We now can see that distant galaxies are all on the move, they're all rushing away, and the pattern of their exodus, the farther the galaxy, the higher the speed, agreed with the mathematical output of general relativity's equations. With mathematical data now supporting physics, even Einstein eventually embraced wholeheartedly the conception of a universe that had a beginning. Communion, sometimes expressed as the entire universe bonded, so that the presence of each subject is felt through the entire spatial and temporal range of the universe. Everything speaks itself that everything is receiving something from every other particle of the universe. Hence, we grasp the communion of subjects. The universe itself is the primary sacred community. It takes a universe to bring humans into being, a universe to educate humans, a universe to fulfill the human mode of being. But it is clear now that too much focus has gone into human interactions or human-divine interactions. Not enough focus has gone into human-earth relations. That is our challenge now. In the emerging Ecozoic era, we experience the universe as a communion of subjects, not as a collection of objects. Earth exists and survives only in its integral functioning. We cannot save the Earth in fragments. The Earth is a single reality. We have recently words of caution on the fragility of Earth's creatures from Pope Francis. In his encyclical Laudato Si, on care for our common home. It is not enough, however, to think of different species merely as potential resources to be exploited, while overlooking the fact they have value in themselves. Their value lies in their creation by God, and we do not have the right to cause their extinction and take away their ability to live their purpose and give glory to God simply by their existence. Because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right. Francis is calling us to see more clearly our responsibility to the larger frame. We are beginning to recognize that the human is a subsystem of the Earth, and that our first obligation is to the entire system. For Thomas Berry, differentiation, inner articulation, and communion are realities emerging from the scientific understanding of the universe. The human must embrace the truth that our own physical and spiritual shaping began with the forming of the universe. So, differentiation, subjectivity, and communion are primary principles governing ethical formation and spiritual shaping of human consciousness. All are derived from the cosmological process. Evolution has both a physical and psychic process. Matter has its physicality without and its psychic within. This is what Berry called subjectivity. In his formula, the universe is a communion of subjects. Justification for such a view of inwardness in matter lies in inductive observation, namely, if interiority exists at one point, as in human consciousness, it must exist throughout the evolutionary process. This dynamic becomes evident in the increase in complexity and consciousness over the arc of evolutionary time. In this sense, human consciousness is not situated as an aberration or addendum, but as arising from out of the evolutionary process. Cosmology yields now to cosmogenesis. Everything is evolving. The present does not remain. Our understanding of what it means to be human continues to evolve. It is an error to assume the current manifestation of the human is the final product of the evolving universe. Study, if you will, our gradual adjustments to the question of gender identity in recent years. What will we understand differently 100 years from now? We are, it is true, of the universe, and we can claim that we are the universe in some sense. The universe conscious of itself at last. How shall we proceed with this insight? What does it mean to be the universe conscious of itself? what responsibilities accompany this discovery? These three values of differentiation, subjectivity, and communion must be respected because they are the values prescribed by the universe. Sadly, our present course can be seen as violating these principles in their most basic expression. We need to turn our focus in Berry's formulation toward the great work. For Berry, the dynamics of our living universe call for active attention and awareness, as well as profound and deep commitment to the great work to highlight our participatory action in ongoing evolution. Berry heard the call this way. The great work before us, the task of moving modern industrial civilization from its present devastating influence on Earth to a more benign mode of human presence, is not a role that we have chosen. We did not choose. We were chosen by some power beyond ourselves for this historical task. We do not choose the moment of our birth, who our parents will be, or our particular culture. We do not choose the status of spiritual insight or political or economic conditions that will be the context of our lives. We are, as it were, thrown into existence with a challenge and a role that is beyond any personal choice. The nobility of our lives, however, depends upon the manner in which we come to understand and fulfill our assigned role. Berry affirmed and expanded this insight, saying the spirituality of Earth refers to a quality of Earth itself, not a human spirituality with a special reference to the planet. The human and Earth are totally implicated, each in the other. If there is no spirituality in Earth, then there's no spirituality in us. The interconnections of the human in this process changed profoundly the role of the human for Thomas. The human could no longer be seen as something created apart from the whole of evolution. As Thomas would say, the human is that being in whom the universe reflects back upon itself in conscious self-awareness. We are the universe come to consciousness of itself. This deepening of interiority in the mind and heart of the human gives cause for participation in the all-embracing processes of universe emergence. For Thomas Berry, the implications for such an encompassing planetary consciousness and a commitment to ecological awareness were clear. They constitute an ontological and ethical imperative for human understanding and action. We must all commit to the great work. These insights have been given wide expression most recently in the encyclical of Pope Francis, referenced earlier, Laudato Si. Gus Speth, a founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council, offers this perspective. I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address those problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy, and to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. The pale blue dot on your screen is a picture of the planet taken many years ago, 1990, from the Voyager spacecraft. And it's a reflection of our little place in the universe. It's a pale blue dot, as they say, and it's 4 billion miles out. We're taking that picture. But the values of differentiation, subjectivity, and communion come into play because they're values prescribed by the universe. And sadly, our present course can be seen as violating that problem. So as we go forward, some words of Pope Francis. We mentioned viruses earlier in these remarks, as they are very much on our minds in these astonishing days. In the entreaty below from Pope Francis, we can hear the echoes of Thomas Berry calling for a more benign mode of human presence. The current pandemic has highlighted our interdependence, says Pope Francis. We are all connected to each other, for better or for worse. Therefore, to emerge from this crisis better than before, we have to do so together. Together, not alone. We must do it together, all of us. in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cawley, for sharing that and having the images as well, which was, I'm sure, for everyone a nice visual representation of some of your remarks. So we'll open it up for questions and answers now. If you'd like, you're welcome to unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can type your question in the chat box. And maybe while folks are thinking, I can pose the first one, Dr. Cawley. So one of the things that you said that really struck me was thinking about Earth as a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, and how really what we need is not necessarily the science, but the cultural and spiritual awakening. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some steps that might take us in that direction? I think we're seeing that there's not necessarily consensus. So what are your thoughts on how we might get there?
Well, we have to get there one at a time, because we're human beings and we're individuals, but we have to get there together, because that's the point of the idea of communion of subjects. I think one of the things that everybody's, I think certainly on this call tonight is aware of is paying attention. We need to pay attention. We need to pay close attention and better attention to what is happening to our common home. I believe that the encyclical Laudato Si has a wonderful program. If you take the time with that document, you can see that Francis elaborates on how we can go forward and how do we pay attention to each other and take care of each other. And that's really the key to making this communion of subjects a reality. I think that's a good starting point, and I would recommend it to everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your answer. Are there others that have questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Cawley, you said something that really grabbed my attention. You talked about the spirituality of Earth, and that we're part of Earth, and we have a spirituality. Then it makes only good sense that the Earth too has a spirituality. Could you say a little bit more about that? It's probably a book, an answer, but if you could say something, just touch on it.
Yeah, I'm sure it's several books. Yes, thank you. I think that's a Thomas Berry insight that I'm still working my way at. That the spirituality of the planet, it's related to his assertion that the entire universe is a product of a creator, that those processes of differentiation and subjectivity and communion are universe processes. So nobody and no thing is exempt from those processes. So we have, as we have come to understand it, are, at least at this point, as far as we know, the only features of the universe that are conscious, but we are of the universe. So you and I tonight are the universe, conscious of itself. We have a spirituality that we are convinced lives in each of us. And it's an insight that Thomas used to say, we need to think about what is the spirituality of the earth? What are the innate gifts that the rest of the universe is bringing to us? I don't know that we have the capacity right now to completely understand it. I'm still working on it, trying to work through my own consciousness. But I think it's out there waiting for us to unwrap it.
Thank you, Dr. Cawley. I think that's the beginning of a larger conversation, and I know we're still processing much of what you shared, but we'll also have time for some more questions at the end. So thank you for sharing. I'd like to introduce our next speaker this evening. So we have Professor Christy Klimas, who is an assistant professor of environmental science and studies at DePaul University. She describes her research as bringing together ecology and economics in urban and tropical settings to address questions of sustainable resource use. One of her research priorities is working with undergraduate students on projects that will give them the skills to conduct and use science throughout their careers. Among others, her courses at DePaul include Applied Ecology, Ecological and Social Economics, Introduction to Sustainability, and Coffee, Chocolate, Ethical Sourcing of Food. So Professor Klimas, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I have to say that my slides may not be quite as impressive as Brother Cawley's, but I hope that you enjoy them nonetheless. So I'm going to build on this culture of communion that really started us off here, but from an environmental science and studies perspective. And this photo is actually a photo of a group of DePaul students in Cerro Verde, which is one of the world's largest copper mines. And so this is the Atacama Desert. And behind us is a mine that goes almost as deep as the Grand Canyon. So when we talk about some of the environmental problems, I want to relate how they're linked to people and then how, some of the solutions. So I'm going to talk on a much narrower scale and focus on some of the work that DePaul students have seen in action. So first I want to share with you the donut model. And this is a model that Kate Raworth came up with, and she is an economist who's done a lot of work on integrating the environment, social justice, and economics. And so you can see from this model that you have this environment, you have boundaries from a finite world, then you have a social foundation. So the society exists within the boundaries, these finite boundaries, and then you have a regenerative and distributive economy. And her work is really fascinating for how to try to think about on very practical and both small and large scales, how to make this work globally. And where are we now? Well, you can actually see on her website where we're at. The red is bad. So it means that we've exceeded our planetary boundaries for climate change, biodiversity loss, land conversion, and nitrogen and phosphorus loading. But what's just as concerning, perhaps more, is that in every social foundation, we are in the red. So you can see that for energy, water, food, health, education, peace and justice, social equity, housing, these are all areas where we have some serious challenges. So where do I come at this from? I'm particularly interested in consumption and trying to bring people together on issues of consumption, because consumption connects us, but sometimes we don't realize the connections that are inherent in these daily transactions. So the way I say it is I'm concerned with the implications and impacts of an economy where we use resources we'll never have again to buy things we don't need to impress people we don't care about. But other people have said this better in terms of a spiritual context. So the ecological crisis is a moral issue. This reflects sort of a very deep-seated desire for something from us as humans. And this is really the repercussions of this are affecting people and the planet. Just one example in terms of consumption is this is over from 1996 to 2014, and the numbers have been updated. We've exported over 20 billion pounds of used clothing from the US to other countries. This is shifting. Our clothes are so disposable right now that nobody wants to resell them. But this indicates the scale of consumption, I think. And so now what I want to do is I want to take this to, how do you create these relationships? How do you create a culture of communion in a society where me buying clothes and the person who makes my clothes may occur in different countries? And so I'm going to talk about this in the context of a study abroad trip that I take DePaul students on. And so this is a trip where we focused on mining and forest resource management, and these are the students who are participating on that trip. And we had a great time. It was very thought-provoking. Why do we do this? Well, I mentioned that this exceeding planetary boundaries or environmental changes happen extremely quickly. So from 1945 to 1990, a span of 45 years, this is the Atlantic coastal forest in Brazil. And you can see that green forested area in 1945, you've lost over 90% of it within a 45-year context. So building these relationships to protect people and the planet within a thriving economy for the common good is absolutely necessary and urgent. Why do we see some of these changes? Well, on a global scale, about 27% of global forest loss is from making stuff or commodity production. And if some of that is mining and palm oil production and things like that, but another 24% is shifting agriculture. About another quarter is forestry, and then wildfire and urbanization combined make up that last bit. When we look area to area in the world, this can actually be very different. So here you can see South America is dominated by red. And so that's our commodity-driven deforestation. So in some places, we're seeing that mostly this is timber management that's driving deforestation. But in South America, it's the production of commodities. Now these commodities, and it's 64% of deforestation, plus or minus 8%. So this is pretty impressive. So we go there. This is Brazil. And in Brazil, the causes of deforestation are mostly linked to agriculture, particularly livestock agriculture. So cattle ranching is the majority, and then small scale and larger scale, small scale agriculture, mostly by people doing what we would call homesteading, are another significant component. When we look in Peru, which is where I go with students, we see a very different story and cause of deforestation. So this is gold mining in the Río Huaypetue in the Peruvian Amazon. And the Peruvian Amazon is a very interesting place because you have this alluvial gold or flakes of gold that have washed down from the mountains, and they're now found under the soil, in the soil under the rainforest. And so to get at these, for many years, these weren't viable. It didn't make sense to go in and try to harvest these flakes of gold, but gold is so valuable right now that now it does. And when we look at this, we see a lot of devastation. This is the trinational area between Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. So this Madre de Deus is the state in Peru, in the Amazon region here. You can see how the mining is concentrated around the river because that's where the gold is. So mining has destroyed 170,000 acres of rainforest in a 5-year period, with 184 square kilometers in a 2-year period. This is a buffer zone outside the protected area. So this is the Tambopata Nature Reserve where you can still do ecotourism trips, and this is a hotspot for international ecotourism. And you can see that this mining, especially small scale mining, is starting to encroach on these protected areas. Now, this is clearly an environmental problem, and yet it is not only an environmental problem. So some of the miners who are doing this small scale mining, which I'll talk about, have come because of conflict from the Shining Path and other terrorist groups within the country, and they've moved to these areas and they need an economic option. So there's somewhere between probably 30 and 40,000 illegal miners, 6,000 of which are in this buffer zone around the protected areas. And while prior to COVID, the Peruvian government did seem to be making some progress on moving them to alternative activities, COVID has really changed the situation. while we're on this photo, I want to talk a little bit about how mining happens. So this looks like a slide, looks like a lot of fun. But really what happens with this slide, this is an area where they've actually removed the miners, but they'll come back. And when they come back, what they'll do is they'll put a carpet on top of that slide, and then they'll dump water and mud, like a slurry, from the river down this carpeted slide. And the flakes of gold will get stuck in the carpet. And so they'll do this, then they'll take that carpet off, they'll put it in a big bucket and get the flakes of gold off. Once they get those flakes of gold off, those flakes of gold are, you don't want them to be flakes of gold, you'd really like them to be a nugget. And so what happens next is that you take this water and you add in some mercury. And when you do that, the mercury gloms together the gold flakes, we call it amalgamation, and then what you do is you burn off the mercury, and then you get relatively pure gold that you can sell in, honestly, there's on any corner in Madre de Dios, you can sell these gold nuggets. So, why is that problematic? Well, this is extremely devastating. Walking through mined areas in the midst of a rainforest, it looks like you're on a lunar landscape. I felt like I was in the desert, but in the distance, you could see forests larger, stretching over 100 feet above your head. But you're sort of in these pockets of sand. And, but in addition to the deforestation, the mercury itself is really problematic. It's bad when the mercury gets in the water, it bioaccumulates, so fish, it goes up the food chain, and then people eat the fish, thus creating problems like infant mortality, neurological problems, things like that. And indigenous communities are affected. Some of the indigenous communities are participating in the mining, but many are not. And so here you have studies that are showing that near these small-scale mining operations, you had mercury levels. So the majority of people, their mercury level was about 15.5 milligrams per kilogram, measured by hair samples. And 2.3 milligrams of mercury per kilogram is considered the threshold of concern in the US. That's probably a little overcautious, but that's really concerning. When we look at hair samples of Swedish women over a 23-year period, they are now at 0.3 milligrams, 0.38 milligrams per kilogram. So this is, the human health impacts of this are devastating, both for the miners and for people who are living in these surrounding areas. So this is not just an environmental problem, this is a coupled problem. Well, why do we do this? In 2000, I would have been able to tell you that the majority of the gold went to jewelry, much of it in India and China, but in the US too. And now that's shifted, but we are still implicated in this. So why are we mining? We're mining because in times of uncertainty, people want safe investments, and gold is one of those safe investments. So we, in countries oftentimes outside of the Amazon, are driving this gold rush that has devastating environmental and human effects. So, one of the things that we really talk about in this class is, what ethics should surround consumption. And this is really, for me, about building relationships. So in fact, not a single student knew before we went on the trip what this looked like, or how they were connected to some of these environmental issues, right? And even when I talk with people now, they'll say things like, "Oh, it's so great that you're going down there because you can help fix deforestation in the Amazon." But I think what we all need to do is sort of look internally and see what how we are involved in systems that may affect this. Laudato Si is oftentimes quoted for some of these issues, and yet the church has been committed to trying to find solutions for a long time. So this is 1990. Modern society will find no solution to the ecological problem unless it takes a serious look at its lifestyle. In many parts of the world, society is given to instant gratification and consumerism while remaining indifferent to the damage which these cause. I would argue that much of this happens because we are so removed from the effects. And, you know, really, this is something that was really important, particularly for the students, is that, you know, while the miners may be the ones that are moving forward some of this damage, they're doing this because of a lack of viable economic alternatives. So our job is not to give them two crappy alternatives and have them choose between those alternatives, but to work globally to make sure that they have the ability to thrive without this sort of activity. So we don't go in and fix this, but what we do is support some of the institutions who are on the ground working to improve the situation. So this is Cincia, and they're a research institute. They're partially funded by Wake Forest, and they work with the communities, they work with the miners, and they do a variety of outreach. So they try to find, you know, they try to help build trust to address these situations in a holistic way. One of the things they do is monitor deforestation, but monitoring deforestation alone is only a piece of the potential solution. What they also do is they work with miners to reforest. They do a lot of biodiversity surveys. They look at what can thrive after mining in these, you know, sort of high mercury, sandy environments. And then they work to reforest. So they're doing a lot of work with biochar. And so this is like the husk of fruit and things like that. And you combust these and they make a very, very rich organic material. And so as you're reforesting, you put this biochar around the plants, and it more than doubles the amount that survive and last in some of these areas. So it's really great. It's all, you know, and it's easy. There's plenty of organic matter that can be made into biochar. And it's relative, you know, it involves a lot of people. And these are things that we want in our solutions. Another example is trying to get revenue from the forest. So this is Brazil nut. You probably get this in Christmas nut boxes. It's a very large nut, and it's also highly caloric, which is great if you're hiking through the Amazon. It's a really good snack. You can see the seeds there. They're enclosed in a capsule, and so people take those, they open them. There's only there's only a couple animals that like actually can chew through and get at the Brazil nuts. So if you get there before the animals, then you can harvest these. These are now made into value-added products. So there's a cooperative working there, and they have international markets. So you can buy chocolate bars with Brazil nuts, and they're also working with many of the individuals in the forest to look at other forest products, like cupuaçu is in the chocolate family, although it's a very acidic fruit. You may have heard of acai, it's all the rage right now. That also comes from some of these forests. So trying to move trying to manage forests to keep them standing, but also get economic value for them can be an alternative solution that has an economic value. Even though I've focused on the Peruvian Amazon because it's one of the places that I take students, and the Brazilian Amazon because it's where I do much of my research, there are projects like this happening globally. So land management to restore degraded areas. There's good work being done in Africa and in the US. Ireland is another example where they're trying to recover previously grazed land, and also places where you do water saving approaches. This is another example. So you have soil and watershed restoration and this increased resilience during an El Nino drought. So these are years where you get more severe droughts than normal. And so if regenerative agriculture works during these years, then that's a good sign. There's also CRS and other groups have done fair trade. So this is not a new strategy. So in addition to trying to bring forest products to market, fair trade has always worked to try to pay a living wage or pay more than the market price to try to create these connections between the people who make products that we buy and us as consumers. So, knowing who grew my eggs is relatively easy if I live in a rural area in the US, but knowing who made my coffee is not. So fair trade tries to strengthen some of these relationships. There's other platforms and policies for things like climate change. So I Am Climate Change campaign via CRS. And then I just want to bring up very briefly the issue of food waste. So if food waste were a country, then its greenhouse gas emissions are close to that of the US. So reducing some of the food waste, and food waste happens for multiple reasons. We tend to throw food away in affluent countries, but food spoils in transit and things like that in other countries. And both of these are problems that different groups are working to address. So I just want to end with a quote from Laudato Si, and just say thank you very much for the invitation, and hopefully I was able to follow Brother Kraut.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Klimas. We really appreciate your presentation. We have a few questions that came in the chat box. So I'm going to read some out and we'll ask for your thoughts on them. So the first reads, regarding the change of rainforest to grazing land in Brazil, I assume that's mainly for food production. Is there an estimated tipping point for global population? Meaning, is there a point where there are more people than we can realistically feed? And have we already reached that point?
It's a really good point. And I think this is potentially good news. We have enough food to feed everyone on the planet. So right now, our global production, if distributed more equitably, would feed every single person. And we are not in danger of not being able to feed people. So right now, this is actually a problem not with food production, but with the way that food is produced and the way that it is distributed. So about different estimates all average around 30% food waste. And again, some of that's from spoilage, some of that's from throwing food away. But food distribution is a big issue. So as long as food goes to people who are willing to pay for it and then is thrown away by grocery stores or is thrown away post-purchase, then this represents a flaw in sort of the global economy, right? So it's prioritizing money over prioritizing equitable and just distribution of resources. And so right now, that's the problem. Brazil is also a unique case. You may have seen it in the news. So, I mean, last year we had fires the likes of which we hadn't seen in over 13 years in the Amazon. So there's so much good work being done in terms of trying to slow deforestation. And much of that, we saw a huge reversal last year. This year, we're seeing very, very similar results. And some of that is definitely agriculture, but some of that is governance. So if you look at Brazil's president, he has sort of to the exclusion of everything else said that he wants to prioritize the economy. And he's really given free rein to anyone who wants to deforest. So there's been there's been a real shift in governance in Brazil. So I think that yes, some of this is food production, but not all of it.
Thank you so much. We'll go with one more question and then we need to move on to our next speaker. The last question is, do you have a good resource naming products or brands which are made by the destruction of the Amazon, something that can be used as we discern what products to buy or not?
Yes, so while Father Memo is talking, I will share some resources in the chat.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I think I can speak for all of us when I say we learned a lot and have many more questions. So thank you for sharing additional resources.
No problem.
And last but certainly not least, up next we have Guillermo Campuzano, who prefers to be called Memo, is a Vincentian priest and vice president of University Mission and Ministry at DePaul University. He returned to DePaul this spring after serving as the Congregation of the Mission representative at the UN. Here at DePaul, he previously held multiple positions, including Director of the Office of Religious Diversity, University Chaplain in Catholic Campus Ministry, as well as Adjunct Professor in the Departments of Religious Studies, Catholic Studies, Modern Languages, and the School for Public Service. So, Memo, if I may, please,
Yes.
The floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Very nice to be with all of you. Thank you to Kevin and Christy for putting me in this terrible trouble to speak after them. So let me share some sustainable values that we as Vincentians trying to implement while we are trying to create this story of sustainability at DePaul University. This is a work in progress. We are creating a story of sustainability in our world, and that's the challenge for all of us. This event is a part of that, the construction of that story. I invested a good portion of my afternoon today talking and helping a father and a mother of a student who was lost for 2 days. And he tested them last night from a river. He was close to a river. Not feeling the connection with the river and the forest, but feeling a terrible isolation and feeling totally separated. And thinking that the river was a solution for him because it could take him away. We live, as a Mexican poet said, in a labyrinth of isolation and separation, in this radical individualism of today. The root cause of the humanitarian and the ecological crisis is precisely that we are living in a paradigm of separation. Is the name of our crisis is coexistence. We live in a broken humanity, a broken human fraternity and sorority. And as Kevin mentioned, what is broken is our paradigm of communion. The narrative of communion is broken. There are millions of human beings who are strangers in our world, and many of them are in a continuous existential and physical exodus, moving from one place to another. The masses of migrants, the masses of refugees in the world are just assigned an example of this world that is populated by strangers, people with no home, people taken from their homes, and many times taken from the homes for the destruction we are causing to the environment. We are broken inside, and we are totally disconnected with our surroundings, with the environment. Last weekend, Pope Francis released his third encyclical, which is a continuous, after the joy of the gospel and Laudato Si, now is Fratelli Tutti, sisters and brothers, all sisters and brothers. Global fraternity and social friendship are in this context, in this labyrinth of isolation, assigned in an effective way to show that another world is still possible, as many have said. and is for us probably our only possibility for a meaningful prophecy. The environmental work should be today the way of prophecy in the Catholic Church. As we read what's going on, I see that the inability to discern that we belong to each other, that we belong to this planet, that we belong to the tree and the tree belongs to us, that we are all deeply connected, underlines the current national struggle that we are facing in the US and in other countries in our world, with the pandemic, with racism, with systemic and sustainable and sustained injustice, with the economic inequality, with consumerism, with the environmental degradation, with the political radicalization, this sense of division that we are totally separated from each other and separated from our planet. Religious fundamentalisms too, and all these flashpoints that drives us to other safe corners where we hide. There are people who hide in their social condition, they hide in the color of their skin, in their securities, their titles. We need to create a new sense of belonging, a planetary sense of belonging, to heal our understanding of the spiritual essence of life that Kevin explained to us so beautifully. The relational model of today is unsustainable. The relational model within the species, in our species, but with other species, with all forms of life. The educational model, the economical model, anthropological model, the ecological paradigm, the political and theological paradigms are unsustainable. This time is calling us for a new relational model. We understand that what is broken is the human coexistence. DePaul is a signatory of the UN Principles of Responsible Management of Education, which states as their first of 6 principles, we will develop the capabilities of students to be future generators of sustainable value for businesses and society at large, and to work for an inclusive and sustainable global economy. Economy, oikos, ecology, the same root. Economy, not to produce capital. Economy, to protect life, to regenerate life, to regenerate and restore the essence and of economy and the essence of politics, to create new paradigms. DePaul has a task force for sustainable initiatives, and this is rooted and grounded in our mission to be agents of social transformation. We want to enhance the mission capacity of our students and faculty, staff, the alumni, and the community partners. We understand, being members of the Vincentian family, that poverty reduction is a process requiring systemic change and political advocacy. That's why we are present at the UN. I am happy to see my partners at the UN in good trouble, and Kevin and Teresa and CJ, who worked there for many years, and Margaret and others. We see that in the Catholic intellectual tradition, there is wisdom. And today there is also a beautiful intuition in the ministry of Pope Francis to build sustainable communities. DePaul has three main features of our identities, how we define who we are, and how we understand DePaul educational mission. We say that we are Catholic, that we are Vincentian, and that we are urban. When we say that we are Catholic, we are a university that systemically tries to embrace all the new intuitions of Catholic social teaching. And in this time, especially the calls of Pope Francis for pastoral, ecological, and relational conversion in what we do. We find in those calls to action. This is a spirituality today is a call to action, to new lifestyles, to new ways of living, to new paradigms. Our Vincentian identity, we want to effectively contribute to the reinterpretation of the Vincentian narrative in this new time. And we see in the very foundation of the Vincentian spirit something that was essential for Vincent and Louise, that we all call what is being called in philosophy and in anthropology, in ethics, the ethics of recognition and the ethics of care. Recognition, open our eyes, being aware. I cannot be by a river without being aware of my connection with the river, how my life depends on the life of the river, and how the life of the river depends on my life and how I treat the river. The ethics of recognition in human coexistence, recognizing the other and not being afraid of the beautiful diversity of forms of life, of human life, ways of thinking, colors of skin, ways of worshiping. The ethics of recognition are essential for intercultural, sociopolitical, and interfaith dialogues, sustainable dialogues, and the ethics of care. Vincent de Paul recognized the humanity in those disfigured, in those whose faces were disfigured by issues of poverty and exclusion. He recognized their dignity, and then he took care of them. And he let them take care of him. It's a mutual exchange of recognition and care. Is what in our spirituality we call contemplation and action. Contemplation will lead us to recognition and care to a transformative action. We are an urban university. We belong to the city. Our roads are the roads of the city, the streets, and our transportation is the train. We are part of a complex fabric, which is beautiful. So the city is like a classroom, a big classroom. And the meaning of what happened in the classroom is only meaningful if it's connected with what's happening on the streets. And our students understand that very well. So our pedagogical approach becomes real in the interaction with the city, in the Vincentian values and the Catholic intellectual tradition and the main and fundamental intuitions of this tradition. The DePaul Sustainability Initiatives Task Force said that our Vincentian charism requires a bracketing in of moral concern, a moral and ethical awakening, a spiritual awakening in the age of sustainability, any effective and systemic approach to serve the poor necessarily includes a heightened moral sensitivity to the global impact of resource consumption and environmental degradation, as Christy told us before. DePaul's sustainability goals are simple and very direct. The expansion of our curricula, focused and related to sustainability, the continual working to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions and build a more sustainable food service system. It's changing our own customs, our own culture, our own lifestyle. Devote more resources to train faculty and staff in sustainable practices. This is a story in construction. We are far from where we should be, where we want to be. I came to DePaul in March of this year after 5 years at the UN, and I came to work in a division of mission and ministry. And I am totally committed, full committed, that the environmental agenda is included in all what we say and do around our mission. To implement a better sustainability-focused research, to create co-curricular opportunities for our students to become aware, to awaken, not just to experience indignation. Ethical indignation is essential, but ethical awakening is our way. We need to experience indignation when we see what's happening to our brothers and sisters, all, to our planet, to all forms of life. But we need to experience ethical awakening to change our actions and to change our lifestyles. There is always in the Vincentian tradition an intuition that was the original intuition, the generating intuition. We always begin with the most vulnerable. And I think this has an implication for sustainability. Our options should be for the most vulnerable in our planet, for the most vulnerable forms of life, and in our species, for the most vulnerable human beings, the more impacted by environmental degradation, by climate change. We have an initiative in collaboration with DePaul USA, so that homelessness has no place at DePaul, that our homeless students are first in our attention, in our care. We have a collaboration with the DAX program to provide housing to our students. I am proud and happy to mention the work of the Vincentian family and many other NGOs at the UN to advance the housing first, the eradication of poverty, and the ending of homelessness. I worked hard for 2 years with some of the people who are in this chat tonight to advance this project. And we always found a connection between homelessness and sustainability. Our hope, our vision, our paradigm is not sustainable if we do not pay attention to the most vulnerable. If there is no hope, I heard this at the UN, if there is no hope for the most vulnerable, there won't be hope for anybody. I want to close with this from the Laudato Si. because all creatures are connected, each must be cherished with love and respect, for all of us as living creatures are dependent on one another. We simply must be human, vulnerable, humble, connected to each other, part of nature and the conscious and spiritual part of the earth, with the mission of caring for the sacred heritage that we have received, Mother Earth, for ourselves and for the future generations. It's a beautiful intuition that Kevin shared with us. The paradigm of communion, the invitation to communion, the regeneration of the essential narrative, the narrative of communion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Campuzano. That was a
Memo, you call me Memo?
I call you, okay, just making sure.
What happened?
Yes, Memo. All right, we'll go to Memo. So thank you so much for your presentation. I think we all learned a lot from both the values as a foundation of this work, but also how we might put that into practice through our structures and our policies, such as the examples that you shared. So thank you very, very much. Are there any questions for Memo at this time?
Thanks God, no.
I have one for you, Memo. No, we have a question in the chat for Professor Klimas as well, but I think it could work for both of you. So let me try. So Professor Ramanath asks, for Professor Klimas especially, you argued for a change towards a new market equilibrium where ethical considerations hold sway, but may I say that a change in norms is slow at best and may be no more than fleeting. Percentage of consumers, and I include myself in it, who say they would buy ethical products and those who actually buy generates a serious ethics gap. And I think, Memo, this also speaks to what you were saying about ethical indignation and ethical awakening to take action, and sometimes there's a gap there as well. So Professor Ramanath's question is, how do you create a market for ethical products that bridges this gap? And I think we can extend that to even beyond the market itself. So I'll pause there and would love to hear from both of you. Perhaps Professor Klimas first specifically, and then more broadly from Memo.
So that's a great question. We actually have a term for that. We call it the attitude behavior gap.
Take a lot of time responding.
No, I'm going to save plenty of time for you, Father Memo. So we call it the attitude behavior gap, where people say they're going to do something and then don't do it. So, you know, one of the things that we really talk about is shifting norms. So you're exactly right. And an analogy that I often give students is, I'll give them the example. So like, what would you think of me if, you know, you were walking down the street behind me and I didn't see you, and I was eating something and I just threw it on the ground. And they all like look at me like, you know, they don't want to tell me how much they would be offended if they saw me do that, but they would. And so we have a very strong norm, a strong social norm around littering, where, you know, we associate it with lack of education and, you know, just laziness. And I think that that's one of the things that we can do, where we have to create a norm where paying a living wage for production of goods is a norm, where it's not always the lowest price, always, which is, I would say, our norm right now. But it should be that we don't accept products where the producers don't get paid enough to live on. And I think that we can do that. So this is not my area of expertise, but global treaties and things like that, where we can link international trade to environmental damage and say that if you go beyond certain thresholds, then that we won't trade those particular commodities with you. And so those are different ways that people have thought about this question. None of these are perfect, and none of these would sort of be silver bullet solutions.
Thank you. And Memo, the nuance the very last piece of that question. Is faith one means to an end of bridging this gap? So I would love to hear your thoughts on this gap as well.
So I have heard, I am not an expert in sustainability, I need to say it, but I have heard so many experts talking about changing the paradigm of production. We are taking the resources from nature and we are not restoring, giving back anything to nature. Today, there are many initiatives to change the paradigms in agriculture that can be applied for all forms of production, and which means that we are willing to change the paradigms of economy and the paradigms of politics, that we are willing to do it because we understand that what is at risk is the essence of everything in this planet, which is life. I work with religious communities. I have heard many religious communities, women and men today, saying that their direction, the direction of religious life, the direction of prophets and people of goodwill of today is the cries of life that are coming to us. The gap is when we do not listen where life is calling us to go, when we do not understand, when we close our eyes and our minds, our hearts to understand what's going on, to find this deep, profound connection, to follow the direction of life, and to respond to those cries coming from life. In everything we do, in absolutely everything we do, in politics, in economy, in education, this is a time that is not simply a crisis. This is a time that is demanding an urgent change. I have heard students writing letters to the administration of DePaul demanding, we demand. Well, there is a call that is demanding us to change the ways in which we live and the ways in which we do things, and that demand is coming from reality, from existence, and especially for what is at risk. I hope that we can experience, each one of us, beginning with me, a real ethical and spiritual awakening.
Adriana, I want to jump in here and
yeah,
just
please. Over to you, Pat.
follow up on what Memo just ended with there. I was already planning to ask Kevin if you might say something, because as far as I'm concerned, the answer is related to that quote you shared, Kevin, from the, I think it was the CEO or someone connected with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, that we won't solve this problem through science, and I would add that we won't solve this problem in a way through the kind of consumption product sort of question, but it's the selfishness, the greed, the apathy, it's the inner piece that I think is critical. That's what brought me into this whole arena. So Kevin, do you have anything more to say about why you chose that particular quote and what you think it means?
Thanks, Pat. Thank you, Memo. Thank you, Professor Klimas. Very helpful, I think, opening up the lens on what we're looking at. The name of the man was Gus Speth, and people may know him. He was the director of UNEP for a long time, the United Nations Environment Program. And Gus is up at Yale and the dean of the School of Forestry and founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council. He was really the kind of an intellectual author of some of these fundamental ideas. But his point was that he thought 30 years of good science would solve these problems. You know, tell people what's going on, tell them here's the problem, and then they'll address it. But he realized he was wrong. He said the problems are not deforestation and bad mining practices. The problems are greed, and apathy, and selfishness. Those are the problems. And I think for any of us who are in this, as we say, in this business of paying attention to the situation, as we say, the predicament we're in now is the result of those things. And particularly, we look, and we can point fingers, I guess, we can all point fingers, they should all point back at us, but the oil industry for years denied that they were to blame for the carbon in the atmosphere. Well, that's selfishness, that's greed. It's not about the science. They knew the science, they knew what was wrong. So that potential for the human to keep making a mess is real. It's in us. It's in us. Even though we are the human and we are the universe coming to consciousness of itself, that's the challenge. We're awake. We should be awake. We have to be awake because we are the solution to particularly this particular planet and what's happened to it. There's nobody else who's going to fix it. The human is, as we say, the key to all of this. And the human has to be awake. And if we stay asleep or we stay selfish, we won't get out of this the way we need to. And we'll be long gone. I suppose people like myself will be long gone. But the young ones who are around us and the nieces and nephews and grandchildren, they're going to look for us and say, what were you thinking? Well, we have to be awake. And that's why I believe that we're very lucky to have Pope Francis and others like him telling us, please wake up, look around, pay attention. I'll stop.
Thank you for that. So Pat, I'll turn it over to you to close this out.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Adriana, for a wonderful job of moderating our session. And thank you to all the presenters. I did, as long as I have the stage here for a moment, a couple of things that came to my mind during the presentations. Memo, you talked again about the river image. And many years ago, and again, I'm offering these as examples of personal transformation. Many years ago, I was up in Montana and I walked into a bookstore and I said, I want to read something that has to do with these issues, climate change and whatnot. I saw a book called Gaia. Anyway, I took the book, I went and sat by a river. And one of the first things I read was about the fact that rivers are part of the circulatory system of our planet. And so if you want to embrace the planet, all you have to do is sit by a river and stick your hand in it. And you are touching the entire planet. So whenever I can, I always do that as a kind of a ritual, as a kind of a, put me in touch with all of Earth and to remind myself of my solidarity and connection to the planet. Another way I do that is if we're of the planet, then we're also of the processes of what we see around us on the planet. So many years ago, I started thinking about that and thought, well, if trees and flowers, bushes in particular, have, during the course of their lifetime, they have like a dormant stage, you know, especially up here in the Northern Hemisphere, we have winter coming upon us, the leaves are falling off the tree. They have this time when they're taking up nourishment from the soil, and then they sprout these leaves and then they bloom with all these flowers. And so I should think of myself as having the same kind of processes. So there are times when I sit by myself and I read or I study or I do research. That's the time when I'm bringing in all this nourishment to myself. But then there are other moments when I'm in front of a crowd of people like you and I'm kind of having a blooming time, right? So to begin, that's just a couple of small examples of how we can in fact change our consciousness and feel close, feel ourselves as of Earth and of the universe processes that Kevin was talking about and Memo was alluding to. So I just share that as some personal examples. I just want to finally add my thanks to all of our presenters. And to close us off this evening, I thought it might be nice for us to just all take a deep breath together with Earth, and then you can just exit in silence. And a good night to all. And again, to everyone who was a part of today, especially our presenters, deep gratitude. Thank you so much for being with us.